You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, and even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today is a Tales from Hollywoodland Kaleidoscope. And now, here's Steve.
Hey, guys. Hello from no longer smoky and fiery LA, but an LA that has completely been knocked off its feet by the most incredible disaster, perhaps in this country's history, in terms of the amount of people. Katrina affected a lot more people, but in terms of total devastation, no one has ever seen this kind of devastation on such a mass quality. 10,000 structures. 10,000 structures. And fortunately, my home is safe, but I had to be evacuated for a week. I'm still out. I'm doing this podcast from a laptop as opposed to my usual desktop. Not that it really matters. And we're very much shell-shocked in this town.
You live, Steve. You live in Brentwood, which is real close to Pacific Palisades.
Right. Well, we're actually 3 miles from the fire line. The fire line came to a place called Mandeville Canyon and has stopped there. There are hot spots everywhere, but you have to give it to the firefighters. An enormous number of firefighters, I think as many as 5,000 firefighters have been fighting this battle, and they've been winning it with airdrops. Part of the problem early on with this fire, it was so windy that a major component of firefighting, which is airdrops, couldn't go airborne. So the guys on the ground, the guys and gals on the ground were completely overwhelmed. I don't think anybody has seen a firestorm this fast, this side of Lahaina, Maui, but on a much larger scale.
You know, God bless each and every one of the first responders and firefighters. Can you possibly imagine what their lives have been like this past week or 10 days or so? My God.
It's also turned that area of the city, both in Altadena and in Palisades, into a toxic soup between the air quality and the fact they can't even use the water. Everything is coated with soot and ash. And it's different when you have a fire in a forest where it's all organic material. In a city where you're burning plastic and metal and all sorts of things, that gets into the air, in the water, and in the ground and creates what I said was a toxic soup.
What is your air quality like today, Steve?
Good. It's good.
No more smell of smoke?
No more smell of smoke, thank God. And we've been looking at the video. So many people we know have lost their homes. The guy who contracted to build our home to do our remodel last year, his home was destroyed. It's just off the charts.
Steve, are there places like stores and markets and restaurants that you went to that are no longer there?
Absolutely. Both major markets in the Palisades were burned to the ground. So many businesses on Sunset Boulevard heading toward the beach are gone. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable how fast everything happened. I mean, it was like the city was torched by a giant fire-breathing dragon. It just took everything down.
A wildfire. Someone actually compared it this morning, compared it of all things to Hiroshima, in that it was flattened. So much of it was flattened out. It's awful.
It's
awful.
The
pictures that you see look like Germany after World War II.
Yes.
What it looks
Which
like.
was firebombed, Julian. Much of it was firebombed.
Yeah,
I was fascinated that when Berlin was a divided city, and I visited there, I was very surprised to see that the Soviet Union, which controlled East Germany at that time, refused to clean it up. So in the 60s, after 20 years after the war had ended, the rubble was still in East Berlin, I think as a reminder of what had happened. It was really a very devastating thing to see. But Steve, you're seeing it sadly in person.
I had that same experience when I went to Dresden in '93 to cross into Poland to do my documentary on the Great Escape on its 30th anniversary. I went to Dresden, and across from a very beautiful modern hotel was a ruined church that had been firebombed in the Dresden fiasco. And I think it was there as a testament to the horrors of that bombing.
If anyone hasn't seen, there's a terrific documentary called "The Fog of War" that was made some years ago.
About Robert
McNamara, who at that time was kind of in charge of a lot of these fire bombings and aiming these fleets
in Japan.
This happened to be in Germany.
Because he was in Japan most of the war. I'm surprised to hear that, but I'm sure you're right.
Well, I can only say what the Fog of War said, and that he would come in the morning and say, how many are dead there? And we killed 23,000. It was just unbelievable. But Dresden was one of those cities. It's quite a documentary, as was. What was the great documentary about Vietnam that Bert Schneider made?
It was 3 words. 3 words, like
Hearts and Minds.
Hearts and Minds, yeah.
Hearts and Minds. Another incredible documentary.
I was on the computer this morning, and there's so much information floating by you so often. There was an interview. It's getting a lot of interest with a claimed second assassin of JFK. Have you guys seen this interview?
No.
This guy was tracked down by an FBI agent. He was a member of the mob prior to Sam Giancana, had all these mob connections. I haven't watched the whole interview, but if you type into your Google JFK second assassin interview, it's a pretty fascinating piece. A number of people have commented on the interview and said they believe it's true. So we may have I don't know. There's so many facets of the JFK assassination. It's hard to believe one over the other, but
it's an industry.
It's an industry. It is so much an industry.
Barry Levinson is now working on a movie, of all things, that the key part of this movie, it's called The Assassin, I believe. The key part of it is what we discussed several weeks ago, is Dorothy Kilgallen's involvement.
Right.
Yeah, well, not in the JFK assassination, but in the interviews with Jack Ruby. She had these interviews, and she was the last person to have them, and she was going to go public with them.
She's heavily portrayed.
That's right. It's true. But the films. I was fortunate enough to interview John Kenneth Galbraith, who was part of the Kennedy administration, the ambassador to India, but also one of America's great economists. And he was assigned after World War II to go to Germany, meet with high Nazi officials, get their stories. And he said what was so impressive was how mediocre they were, how limited these men were, who had been top in the Nazi Germany government. So it's an interesting history that you learn.
Lots of times in the dictatorships, people who run things are not too competent and are cronies, and they appoint cronies, and on it goes.
It sounds very familiar.
Yes.
The other thing I heard, and this was going to be a guest on another thing I was going to be a part of, but he couldn't make it that day, was someone who has a lot of evidence now that the SS, the elite of the Nazis, were all drug addicted, and that they were all just.
I've read that.
Yeah.
So were the soldiers, Steve. Yeah. So were the soldiers.
Soldiers to perform some of the heinous acts that they did. perhaps that was the only reason that they could do things and wake up in the morning with a clear head. I don't know if they ever had a clear head, but
Let's talk showbiz. Let's talk Hollywoodland. Let's talk about what's going on or what's been going on, and let's start with Julian. Any kind of great memories you got going, Julian, from days gone by?
I was lucky enough to interview George Burns, and he told me such a wonderful story that I will relate to the three of you guys and hopefully the audience, was that he was, as we all know, very close to Jack Benny. And they went to the Hillcrest Country Club in Los Angeles for lunch often. And he was going to have, Jack Benny that day was going to go downtown Los Angeles and sign the largest contract in the history of television, the largest ever. And then he and George were going to have lunch at the Hillcrest. So Benny, Burns is waiting for him. Benny comes in and he said, George, you won't believe it. And George says, I know, Jack, that contract. He said, no, if you go 30 miles an hour on Wilshire, you'll make all the lights.
that was the old days, Julian. You can't do it anymore.
You can't go 3 miles an hour.
The LA traffic grid is so, I mean, listen, I've lived in LA practically my entire life. We have some of the greatest roadways in the world. They're very simple to go. It's either east, west, north, or south, but they futz around with the traffic signals. You're cruising at 40 miles an hour, and all of a sudden there's a traffic light and no cars come across for a full minute. I'm sitting there saying, why is this traffic light here? I mean, my flow, as we get older, we know it's all about flow, right?
Oh. You understand, in Midtown Manhattan, Steve, there is no such thing as 40 miles per hour. In Midtown Manhattan, it's 2 miles an hour.
That's right. 40 minutes to go 2 miles.
Now, mentioning George Burns also is the man who said at the age of 98 years old that having sex was like shooting pool with a rope. That's what George Burns said, amongst many other things.
Yeah.
He was something. He really was something.
Yeah. I had a funny thing happen years ago. My company that I worked for, Walter Reed, had built the Ziegfeld Theater in New York City. It was a first-run theater, 1,200 seats, incredible sound, everything you could possibly want, and one of the first new theaters built in the city. But it wasn't on Broadway. It was supposed to compete with Broadway, but it was on 54th Street between 6th and 7th Avenue. And so it was impossible, very hard to get movies because all the studios wanted to give the movies to the Broadway and the East Side theaters. But through a lot of cajoling, we finally got Ryan's Daughter, David Lean's new movie at the time. And I lived a few blocks away from the theater in the 70s, and the manager called me. And he said, I don't know what to do. There's so many people coming. Because you have to remember, we were doing no business. So he wasn't sure how to handle it. And I jumped in a cab, came down and said, have a ticket holders line and sell tickets here. And we did everything right. Phones are going off the hook. I'm in the manager's office. I pick up the phone, as does he. And he says, the Ziegfeld Theater. And the voice on the other end says, there's a bomb in the theater. Now, so help me God. He said, no, we're playing a good movie now. I always wondered, what did the Mad Bomber think of that particular sentence? What? Anyhow, as you could imagine, we had to empty the 1,200 people out of the theater.
Oh,
and
God.
You had to. You couldn't take a chance,
And what do you do in a situation like that, Julian? Do you give them all refunds, or do they?
No. What happened, Steve, was that the great thing about the city, they came so fast. These patrol men with dogs, with German Shepherd dogs, who came and I guess sniffed all over the theater, found out there was nothing there. People waited outside, and then we brought everybody in, and we continued the show. So, of course, I went home. Thrilled to get out of there, just in case the Mad Bomber had hid the bomb someplace else. But
some years ago, I was in Rome at the airport, and they had a sale on Italian Perusian chocolate. So I bought like 5 boxes of these chocolates, and while this was happening, there were these bomb-sniffing dogs all over the place. This was in the 1980s. And one of these dogs got over to me and was going after the chocolate. And I don't speak much Italian, trying to say to the soldier, "What is chocolates? For God's sake, please get the dog out of here." I want to tell you a story. Julian tells a story about the theater. We had a theater in Tamarack, Florida, and our most popular demographic was older senior citizens. God bless them. We had a bargain theater, did a lot of business there. But unlike any theater I've ever operated or been involved with, the people would generally queue up to the box office, and instead of naming the movie, they'd say something like, "Could I have 2 tickets to Robert De Niro, and I'll have 1 Meryl Streep," not mentioning the titles of the movies. These, God bless them, the same people who would go to the candy counter and say, "Could I taste the lime soda? Or could I have a little bit of water?" The guy was an amazing place. "Could I taste the popcorn? If it has too much salt, I get a thing in my throat."
So what are some of the items you carried at that counter that you wouldn't carry in a non-senior citizen, theater,
Alka-Seltzer. Just kidding.
Steve, hearing aids.
Hearing aids.
Well, we did actually, theaters, you do have hearing aids because you have these contraptions that if you plug into the seat, you hear better.
They get headphones, right?
Headphones. We use those constantly. But they were these people, God bless them, were such a loyal group. They'd come and see almost anything we played. We always tried to book movies with stories and things that they would love. We had a movie called, the biggest picture we ever had in that theater, and we had a lot of them, was an obscure thing called Dough, Dough, which took place in France. And the whole story had to do with a French baker who was doing no business and winds up hiring, out of the goodness of his heart, a young African boy who comes in, and by mistake, he has his marijuana, the pot falls into the dough making, and all of a sudden the holly and the bagels were coming out with pot, and all of a sudden this place caught on like forgive the expression, wildfire, and there were lines every morning for the people who couldn't get enough of the holly bread, and it was all full of pot. This picture hit so big, it was like Gone with the Wind.
That's kind of a remake of Monkey Business, not the Marx Brothers Monkey Business, but the Ginger Rogers, Cary Grant movie Monkey Business, where he's a scientist, and when he goes home at night, the chimpanzee gets out of the cage and starts pouring this liquid together and creates a youth serum.
Steve, doesn't Marilyn Monroe have a little role?
Yes.
Yes. A very jiggly Marilyn Monroe. Of course, she was always very jiggly, but she is adorable. The thing I find very interesting about this movie, it was shot in and around the 20th Century Fox lot on Pico, and I lived in the neighborhood, but this was shot 4 years before I got to California, so I get the chance to see what that area looked like in 1951 when they shot this. And
what was it called, Steve?
What?
What was the title?
Monkey Business.
Monkey Business.
And by the way, that's how I saw my first Marx Brothers movie, because I stayed home from school once. I had a cold or something, and Monkey Business was being shown, and I thought it was this Ginger Rogers, Cary Grant Monkey Business. It turned out to be the Marx Brothers Monkey Business. Yeah. And I saw my first Marx Brothers movie, and guys, the Marx Brothers during the 60s and 70s were so big, they were discovered by a new generation of young kids. In fact, they had a 4-film marathon at the Universal Amphitheater, and everybody loved it. And to this day, Billy Rebeck, my writing partner, and I talk about how much Groucho respected language, the ability to turn a word or a phrase and get a joke out of it. And I find that that's one element that's very much missing today from American comedy, a love of language and how you could play around with it.
The very first movie I ever saw my father took me to see was A Night in Casablanca. which was the last movie that the Marx Brothers made together throughout the whole movie. They made, Love Happy, and Groucho made a cameo, but by and large, the very last movie was A Night in Casablanca. Years later, I was able to buy the negative of that movie. And when I got the negative, I also got the papers of the Marx Brothers and some of the correspondence. And I found the correspondence between the Warner Brothers attorneys and the Marx Brothers attorneys. It seemed when they announced that they were going to make A Night in Casablanca, Warner Brothers put them on notice that they, Warner Brothers, owned the name Casablanca because they had made the movie. And the Warner Brothers were going to sue, and the Marx Brothers lawyer was going to say, you can't sue, you don't own the name of Casablanca. And it goes back and forth until finally Groucho Marx writes to Jack Warner. And he says, we're getting these ridiculous letters about you suing us on Casablanca. If you pursue this, I want you to know we will be suing you because we were the Marx Brothers before you were the Warner Brothers.
Julian, you did a thing with Mike Nichols. You did an interview with Mike Nichols, one-on-one. I think it was for Witnesses, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Which had me laughing.
And I did it for
hard.
American Mass Author.
Where he talked about Jack Warner meeting him the first time and thinking he was from Central Casting.
Yeah.
He didn't think it was him.
He couldn't believe it.
He was perfect. He was perfect.
And in today's world, it's a terrible story to tell. Nichols was going to be meeting with Warner, and Warner was telling him that over the weekend he had been playing tennis, and he said they were with the Shah of Iran, and he kept telling his partner to hit it to the Chinaman.
The Shah of Iran. Oh, God.
So I guess he wasn't really up on who and what people were, thinking the Shah was Asian.
Do you know, there's a great story, true story. My partner's father, from Boston, in the film business, was very close to Joe Levine, who was from Boston. And he tells a story that he went up to visit Joe one day and in New York City. And some guy knocked on his door, and there was a problem with his window, with Joe Levine's window. So he thought it was a guy coming to fix his window. This little guy walks in, and Joe Levine says, "It's over there. It's that window." And he's, "What are you talking about?" It turned out to be Dustin Hoffman, who was there to meet him because he was chosen by Mike Nichols to play in The Graduate.
That's exactly. It's a true story.
Yeah.
And it was, he had leak. The window was leaking. It was raining, and there was some rain coming in. And they put Dustin in a janitor's uniform with a pail and a mop and everything. And he came in when he found out he was going to be the lead. He was not thrilled about that idea.
Yeah, great. A great story that Barry Levinson tells. He moved up to Marin County, and Dustin visited him one day. And decided while whatever was happening, decided to walk outside and take a walk around the grounds. And he kept walking, and he happened to see a swimming pool. He sat down next to the swimming pool, which was not Barry's. It was his next door neighbor's. So his next door neighbor's wife is at the window doing something. Looks out the window and she sees Dustin Hoffman sitting in Marin County. This is not Hollywood. And calls out to her husband, "You wouldn't believe who's sitting at our pool." Little Dustin.
Talking about titles and protecting titles, the TV series The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which debuted in the fall of '64 and became quite a hit for a short period of time, was originally called Solo, named after the character of Napoleon Solo, played by Robert Vaughn. By the way, the character of Napoleon Solo and the character of the later TV series The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., April Dancer, were both characters created by Ian Fleming, who created James Bond. But Ian Fleming couldn't participate in the series in any meaningful way other than suggesting some characters. Anyways, when the people making the James Bond movies in 1964 discovered that The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was going to go out as Solo, They sued because there's a character in their new James Bond movie, Goldfinger, named Mr. Solo. And it's kind of a thin little lawsuit in the sense that, come on, he's not even a main character. But it forced the producers to change the name of the show to The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which, of course, has become one of the legendary shows. I got a fun story to talk about. It's a little related to movies because there have been a number of movies done on the subject. Remember D.B. Cooper, the character who jumped
Yes.
out of an airliner over the Northwest?
They made a movie about it.
They made a movie about it. They've written several books about it. So one of those books was called Free Fall. And I was working at my first PR agency in LA in the early 80s. And I was tasked with promoting a novel, which was thinly based on the D.B. Cooper mystery. Well, if you're a publicist and know anything about public relations, it's almost impossible for anybody to write about a novel. Unless it's a very famous author, it's impossible to get any coverage. And I was racking my brain trying to figure out, because this guy who had written the book had done a lot of research about this character. If you're not familiar with the D.B. Cooper mystery, it's the story of a guy who gets on an airliner, and I think it was 1971, and demands money, and claims he has a bomb on the plane. And of course, they give it to him, and then he lands. I guess he landed in, I'm not sure if it was Portland. They gave him the money, and then he insisted on flying to Washington State, and then he jumped out of the airplane at 10,000 feet and was never seen again. There's rumors over the years that he survived, changed his name, and was living somewhere. Or
he didn't have a parachute, right, Steve?
No, he had a parachute.
Yeah.
He definitely had a parachute. So I'm sitting there in a Hollywood office racking my brain when all of a sudden some of the original money that was given to D.B. Cooper is found on the banks of one of the rivers in Washington State. So all of a sudden, all the press who had rejected me are all calling me saying, where is this expert on the D.B. Cooper mystery? We had to hold a press conference at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. All the press outlets were in town. It was a zoo, and it was so much fun. That was the plus side of doing that campaign.
Want to talk about the great golden old days of nightclubs in the United States, which began certainly in the 1940s, were very strong post-World War II, and then the 50s and into the 60s when it kind of stopped. In the late 1960s, I'm in Boston, and I would love nightclubs and show business and performers, and I've seen virtually every big act you could possibly think of in nightclubs, including Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Bobby Darin, Nat Cole, Buddy Greco, who was a great talent. And there was a night. So there was the Copacabana in New York. There was the Coconut Grove in Los Angeles. There were these major great nightclubs in every major city in the United States. And in Boston, and by those nightclubs were fabulous. They were dressed with, if it was the Coconut Grove, it was like with that trees in the nightclub. You might see it in the Howard Hughes, or I think it was called something with Leonardo DiCaprio that Marty Scorsese did. You see a good look of the Coconut Grove. So these nightclubs were all unique. They all had these great looks. But in Boston, there was a guy named Stanley Blinstrup. He was on the A list of nightclubs, and his nightclub was called Blinstrup's. And one night, a girl said to me, "Let's go see Jimmy Durante at Blinstrup's." Well, Jimmy Durante, what am I going to see? You know, I mean, I had never seen him before. I knew he was a classic entertainer. We go there. Blinstrup's, the only way I can describe it would say, if there's a YMCA in your town, it looked like the gymnasium at the YMCA. It was like a gym. There was even an overhang thing where sometimes I would think people would run around, but it was just no frills whatsoever. And here I go to see Jimmy Durante, and folks, I'm here to tell you, this probably was the greatest nightclub act I've ever seen in my life. The people who came to see him were fans of his for years and years, and they would always come to see him whenever he appeared in Boston, as I'm sure they did in clubs all over the place. So they loved him so much that they would get drunk. A lot of these people were drunk, and it became more like a sporting event than a nightclub act. They were standing on top of tables. Jimmy, boy, we love you. We love you. They run up on the stage. They had to be taken off by security people. It was something the likes of which I've never seen before.
Was he like a stand-up comic? He telling jokes all night?
Jimmy Durante?
No.
He was one of the great showman entertainers of all time.
Well,
he played the piano. He sang. He was certainly a comedian as well.
He was funny. He was Jimmy Durante.
With a gigantic nose, Schnozola.
Schnozola was his name in the 40s and 50s. The schnoz. Sinatra was the voice. Betty Grable was the legs, which were ridiculous.
I think the only thing I ever saw Jimmy Durante in was he kicks the can at the beginning of It's a Mad
World. Yeah.
Well, but he was a major star. Believe me, Jimmy Durante was huge.
You never saw it happened in Brooklyn with Sinatra and him? No,
I didn't see that one.
Oh,
yeah. Well, he became a movie star, but his main thing was appearing in person, and television, being a big star in television. Of course, Jimmy Durante is classic. But the audience reaction to this, unlike anybody I've ever seen, people basically became part of the show. And
he was known as the easiest touch in show business.
Everybody loved Jimmy Durante.
People who were down and out, actors and comedians would come up to him, and he'd always give them money. He was as nice a man as you could ever meet. I'm told. Yes. I never met him. I did meet Marge Durante, his wife, and she told me a story that I never forgot. The story was that they wanted very much to adopt a child, but he was too old. He was very old when they wanted to do this. But they went before the judge, and the judge said, "Do you think you people can be parents at your age?" And they said, "Yes, Your Honor, we do." He said, "Let me tell you." He looked at Durante and Marge, and he said, "Fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you."
Yes.
And he gave them the baby.
And one of the reasons for that song, Steve, this will help you and all of the other younger people who are listening to this podcast, and Mike, when you saw Sleepless in Seattle, the end of that movie, you hear Jimmy Durante singing, I think it was Fairy Tales Can Come True.
Yeah, young at heart.
His voice was as unique in its own way as was Louis Armstrong's. So Jimmy Durante would sing, "You must remember this. A kiss, a dis is D-I-S." This was his language. And he was unique. But he was a fantastic performer. And he had a partner. He started out with a group called Clayton, Jackson, and Durante. And Lou Clayton passed away, but Eddie Jackson, his old partner, survived. Eddie Jackson did something called the strut, which has not been done since. But
we're all grateful.
It was like a horses dancing. It was something you just fell in love with. But whatever these guys did, Jimmy Durante and Eddie Jackson, made the people in the audience come to life. If they were drinking, they would just slobber all over them. "Jimmy, boy, we love you. We love you." And they'd grown up on the stage. And Durante's part of his act, he'd take the top of the piano and throw it up to the drummer. You got to start off each day with a song, even when days go long. That's Jimmy Durante, as best I could do it.
And the things would happen that were not good purposely on stage. And he would turn and say, "I'm surrounded by assassins."
That's right.
"I'm surrounded by assassins."
Nothing but pure entertainment. That's what it was, Steve. Unlike any other nightclub act that ever was, he was just plain entertainment. And the people loved this. They had a love affair with Jimmy Durante.
And television in the early days had a show called the 4-Star Review. And the first week was Ed Wynn. The second week was Jack Carson. The third week was Jimmy Durante. The fourth week was Danny Thomas. And that was each week called the 4-Star Review.
Yeah, I didn't remember Jack Carson in that, but now that you remind me, I do.
Yeah, it was really quite something in the early days of TV. You could see, as you said, Arthur, you could see everybody. Everybody was going on doing television. It was so exciting, especially for kids, because we didn't have to leave our home. And there they were, the greatest entertainers in the world, 4 feet away.
Now the only time you see performances like that are at award shows. It's only
Yeah. Well, and they're not performing; they're bullshitting.
yeah.
Or
Yeah. No,
they
Arthur,
do. They get up and say this terrible talk stuff that they're fed to say back and forth to you. They don't unnecessary.
Arthur, what was the name of the theater in Boston that you saw, Jimmy?
Blindstrom's. It was not a theater; it was a nightclub.
Lindstrom's reminds me of the Fillmore West in San Francisco.
Yes.
Literally sat on the floor of what looked like a gymnasium. That kind of low key, of course,
Listen, you got a thing in L.A. called the Elrod.
El Rey.
Where the El Rey, where a friend of mine years ago, Alan Garfield or Gruwitz, a great character actor.
I worked with him.
All right, well, so he calls me. He says, "Hey, Arthur, I got a couple of tickets. To Bob Dylan. We're gonna go see Bob Dylan. We go to the El Rey Theater where there's no seats. You had to stand in the whole place. There was a bar downstairs. You've been there, Steve?
Not as a theater. I went there. It used to be a movie theater.
Well, they took the seats out. They took the seats out, and the entire place was pot. You walked in there and you got stoned by just breathing.
Well, that was my experience at the Fillmore West. I spent the whole night, literally. By the way, the concert was Santana and Dr. John the Night Tripper. I'll never forget. All night long, I'm passing marijuana back and forth. I probably got as high as anybody, but I wasn't smoking.
So Alan's tickets were upstairs in a special place where, for some reason, the entire upstairs, standing, drinking, smoking pot, was filled with supporting character actors. You look around and say, there's Steve Buscemi, there's Alan Garfield, there's this guy, there's that guy. And it was a wild and crazy night with Dylan singing, let's talk about Bob Dylan's movie that's out now, doing more business than people expected. But God knows if they'll ever break even. I think their budget was $65 million. Add 10 easy for marketing, $75 million. They'll probably do 50 to 60, which is more than people expected. But as we all know, that cuts down to 30, and that leaves about a window of $45 million, unless they come out big in foreign. Julian, Bob Dylan foreign, does it make it?
Pretty good in certain
England?
territories. Yeah,
England,
in certain territories.
Yeah.
But, there was the Latin Casino. Remember that nightclub?
Absolutely, in Philly.
Very big one. And then there was, what's his name? Skinny D'Amato had the
500 Club.
500 Club.
By the way,
Atlantic City.
By the way, if you have not seen the Bob Dylan movie, starring Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan, it is a winner.
I will see it.
I would not be surprised. Why it will be nominated for Best Picture this year, but I predict, I'll be on the line right now. I predict the Best Picture of the year is going to be Wicked.
Well, that's a pretty safe prediction, no?
I think it's pretty safe. It's just a combination of filmmaking skill and pure entertainment. Listen, there are a lot of great movies being released this year, but every time somebody mentions some of them to me, they sound so darn depressing.
Steve, why did the Bob Dylan movie, what's it called again?
It's called A Complete Unknown.
Why did it get such bad reviews?
Yes, as I recall, you also predicted that it was going to bomb, and it has not.
Well,
bombed.
no. All I said was it's getting terrible reviews.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of critics these days because I think critics have a tendency to nitpick films to death, and I don't know where they're coming from. I thought the performances were wonderful. You've got Ed Norton playing Pete Seeger. You've got this wonderful actress, Monica Barbero, from the Top Gun sequel. She's playing Joan Baez. She's terrific. And then Elle Fanning plays the girlfriend of Bob Dylan. Just wonderful.
What were John Wilkes Booth's last words? His last words were, "I'm sorry, I thought he was a critic."
I don't think the critics have any kind of power compared to what they did when we were young in the business. When Pauline Kael and Andrew Sarris and Vincent Canby really could make or break a movie, they can't anymore. They can't, and it's good.
Julian, not only that, the critics that the people read the most are online. They could be your next door neighbors.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, no, it's very true. It's the criticism world has been democratized by the internet. how many people are reading newspapers anymore? I mean, newspapers, I have lived in LA since 1955. The Los Angeles Times used to be a terrific paper. On Sundays, in the calendar entertainment section, you had to go through 20 pages of stereo ads before you got to the first feature. We don't even have an entertainment section most of the week. I'm on Saturdays most. There's no entertainment section. Forget about the fact that they don't publish the overnight sports scores anymore, which really upsets me. But the papers have disappeared in so many cities.
I was thinking the other day of how things changed in so many ways in our lifetime. And I do remember having a theater with a lady manager who was very, very involved with the theater. She really cared about things. And we would have kiddie shows in the morning or at noon. And folks would drop their children off and they'd go see the show. And the show, this particular one we were having, was the Flintstones. And a friend of mine was involved, so I went down to the theater where it was going to be playing. And the kids are screaming and yelling and having the most wonderful time. And this manager is running up and down the aisles going, shh, shh, shh. He's trying to stop because she was so used to telling an audience to be quiet that she thought she should do the same with the kids. The kids, of course, totally ignored her, but that was her contribution. When Arthur, you'll remember this, there were matrons in the theater when we used to go. Do you remember that?
Of course. With the white outfits. They look like nurses.
Yeah, and they were in nurses' uniforms, but they were the matrons to shut the kids up. And I do remember a friend of mine putting his foot up on a seat in front of him, and the matron came with a flashlight, smashed his knee to get it off. They were tough. They were tough ladies.
I remember when we saw the Jolson story. I'm like 6, 7 years old, and a group of me and about 6 friends go to see the Jolson story. And one of my friends was so taken by the Al Jolson music in the movie, he actually ran out during the movie to the aisle where they had these long carpets and got down on his knees and started singing. We couldn't control it. The kid went bananas. What happened was he had corduroy pants that were a little wet from the rain that attached to some dots and juicy fruits on the carpet, and we couldn't get him up. And the matron came down the aisle with her flashlight. Get up, and he's pulling this kid and hit him on. He's a Swanee.
Is that how they invented Velcro?
Hey, no, that's not how they invented Velcro.
That's when they should have invented Velcro. Yeah. Velcro.
Oh, I used to love dots, but we as youngsters could do some interesting hijinks. A guy I knew, when we were in the movie theaters when I was little, people would throw popcorn boxes like frisbees. They would be flying left and right. But somebody threw a full ice cream bar at the screen, and it hit the top of the screen and stuck. So we watched the second feature of a double feature through ice cream, the whole, as it floated all the way down.
It started dripping and everything, dripping across.
It started dripping down.
One of the worst things that happens in movie theaters today is while the movie's playing, people use their cell phones. Even though they're told not to, it's announced on the screen. I can attest to this, and it is a pain in the ass.
How do you think it feels on Broadway when you're paying a couple of $100 and these morons are talking into their phone while the show's going on?
Even on Broadway, Julian.
Even on Broadway.
That shocks me because it's a whole different kind of a thing. Really.
You would think, well, not anymore, Arthur. Everything's changed.
Yeah.
Well, going back to Wicked, a number of theaters that people started singing along with the soundtrack, and some people found that disturbing.
Well, they built it in now. You can do that. They have certain performances where you can do that. Steve, you saw Anora?
I did see Anora.
Now they're saying that could be
that to me is the surprise movie of the season because it starts out very dark and then gets very comedic. It's a dark comedy, and this Mikey Madison, this young lady, last year the big news was Emma Stone playing the Poor Things girl, where she's naked half the movie. This year, it's Mikey Madison, and although she's not naked half the movie, she's a force of nature, and I think she's going to get a nomination. I think.
Are you voting?
I've already voted for the Producers Guild Awards, and I voted for it for Best Picture. It was one of my 10 choices.
Could you tell us what your 10 choices were?
I voted for Wicked. I voted for a Complete Unknown. I voted for a movie that nobody seems to want to talk about. I liked it very much, called Blitz by Steve McQueen, the director, about the London Blitz. Saoirse Ronan plays a mother searching for her son. I thought it was beautifully directed. I said Anora. What else did I like this year?
Give me the sleep. Give us the sleeper shot this year. Is there a sleeper?
It could be Anora. It could be Anora. I think it has a shot.
I wonder if they're going to keep the Academy Awards.
Well, Julian, they're pushing them back, but they pushed back the announcement too.
Yeah, right. Because I haven't gotten even a ballot to vote yet. So
the other movie that's getting a lot of attention, it's supposed to be an epic film. It's very long. It's called The Brutalist. 3 hours and 30 minutes or 3 hours and 20 minutes with an intermission built in. It's an epic story. That's also getting a lot of attention. I haven't seen it yet. There's some very good movies, but very few, no comedies. And of course, every week I say there's no comedies.
Well, are there any great, is there a movie this past year that you would call an outstanding film that was a rom-com? Was there a rom-com this year?
Not one that jumps out at me.
Was there a Harry Met Sally or a Sleepless in Seattle?
No,
was there anything like that?
No, unfortunately not.
There hasn't been one since the Harry Met Sally and Sleepless in Seattle.
We watched the other night. We watched for the 10th time, probably over a period of years, American President. How could they not make that kind of movie anymore? The movie's gold.
One of my all-time favorites. In fact, I'm trying to reach out to the writer of that movie, who did The West Wing, whose name escapes me for a second.
Aaron Sorkin?
Aaron Sorkin wrote The American President.
Right.
It's the 30th anniversary of the release of that movie this year. It was originally released in 95. So it's turning 30 this year. But it's time, everybody. We've come to the end of our show. We're going to turn it over to the irrepressible Mike Faber, our producer and our host, and the guy who puts it all together. Mike, it's all yours.
Thank you, my friends. It's always great. You've reached the end of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you could also find us wherever fine podcasts are found, and now you can even find us up on YouTube. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening to us, please give us 5 stars. If you're into social media, please check us out on Instagram and Facebook. Before we get out of here, let's check with the guys and what's happening this week on their podcast. Julian, who are you talking to this week?
This week is Tony Shalhoub, Mr. the Monk himself. And we talk about a lot of his career, including the wonderful movie he made with Stanley Tucci. I don't know how many people saw it, but it's a terrific film, and you'll hear a lot about Tony and his career.
And if you ever watch the movie Big Night with Tony Shalhoub in it, don't go in hungry. You will be tortured in this film.
Yeah.
All right, Steve, are you coming back with your show this week?
We are still dark, unfortunately, because of the fires. Nobody seems to want to talk about anything else in Hollywood at the moment. But coming up in a show, I have the wonderful Judd Newborn talking about Hollywood and the Holocaust. Unfortunately, that's exactly what we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. But this is obviously a much more somber discussion about movies about the Holocaust in World War II. And hopefully we'll be on track soon.
That is awesome. I hope you get up sooner than later, my friend, because it's just so sad what's happening out there. So, Arthur, what are we talking about next?
First of all, Julian, I saw Tony Shalhoub on Broadway in the Heidi Chronicles about 1990. First time I ever saw him. Fantastic. And he's had the career he deserves. We're talking about famous people in Hollywood and their diets, what they eat or what they don't eat. As an example, Clark Gable's favorite sandwich was 2 pieces of rye toast with a big fat piece of onion in the middle and mustard on top. So think of it. You know, we all have our different loves and dislikes for food, and so do the movie stars of Hollywood, old and young. So that's what we're talking about.
All I want to know is, what did Jiminy Cricket eat?
Probably flies.
On behalf of Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks again for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber. We will see you next time here on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts right here.
All right, monkeying around, start talking.
Mr. Bobalina, Mr. Bob
Shiny calling Alameda.
About your podcast.
We talk about an Emmy-winning comedy series.
We talk about a band who outsold the Beatles and the Stones in 1967.
Still sticking to that story, huh? Well, if you know what's good for you, you'll change your tune.
We talk about a groundbreaking multimedia project
that inspired generations of artists and fans.
All right, throw the book at them.
This book is overdue.
Monkeying Around, a podcast about the monkeys.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.